Dobre, prosím, poďte si posadať, začíname. A teda všetci nás poznáte, nemusíme asi veľa hovoriť o SFL a Students for Liberty, ale sme teda študentská neziskovka a robíme takéto cool eventy pravidelne, alebo teda ako sa nám darí pravidelne. A dnes tu máme špeciálneho hostia z Luxemburska, je to Bill. Bill, thank you very much for coming and you're a special guest here, so audience is yours and really, really thanks for coming. I really appreciate it and people also, so I hand over to you and
thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me. I'm not sure if hopefully the audio works this way. Thank you so much for having me. This is my second time in Bratislava. I was here 2 years ago when the weather was just slightly better than this, so that was an enjoyable time I have here in Bratislava. Thank you so much for joining the conversation on the European Union. You are part of the people that think that just because the election is over, you can still be interested by this topic, because I think it's very relevant. I would just point out as well that I'm a committed non-voter, so I don't think that if you didn't vote, that doesn't mean that you can't be part of the conversation. Actually, I believe it makes you more, it should make you more incentivized to be part of the conversation. Now, how European is the European Union? The question that I raised, and by the way, you can find me on here. Oh, is this working? Oh, should I just? I should switch it on. That helps. Yeah, I already switched it. Oh, Keynote, PowerPoint. Oh, Keynote.
maybe Keynote. Maybe you have to point there. Oh, come on.
It was working before. Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. So you can find me personally on here. You can check out my website and my Twitter. But the question that I asked, and I wrote this piece in January 24th, 2018, the question that I was asking was, what are European values anyway? Because we're constantly told that we should support the European project, the European Union, because it has European values. And that gets constantly thrown at us. So every project that they start, they always tell us this is a reflection of European values. So the question I was asking is, what are the motivations of the people who tell us that we need to have European values? What are those European values? And how European can the European Union really be? But before I start, on what I like to do with my audiences is ask some questions and play a little game. So maybe I'll test your knowledge here. I'll show you some pictures of European commissioners, and you tell me if you know them. I know that some people might have already played this game with me at one of my presentations. So this is the first person. She's a European commissioner. Who is she? Oh, some people might go, oh, because they're supposed to know them through their studies. These are very important people. They make the legislation for all of the European Union. That's 500 million people. So eventually we might actually know them. This is Marianne Thyssen. She's the commissioner from Belgium. She's in charge of labor policy. So all employment policy goes through her. She's supposed to figure out how we all get jobs. This guy. This jolly good gentleman? No, nobody knows him. This is Carlos Moedas, and he is from Spain. Recently somebody actually corrected me on that. I think it was Portugal. Nobody cares because nobody knows. Carlos Moedas is in charge of innovation, so he's supposed to figure out how we get a Silicon Valley of Europe. So this man is in charge of figuring that out, which is great because he at least has some sort of background because he's an engineer. So I guess maybe, but he has a big budget to figure out how we innovate Europe. This man. Nah, never seen him. Me neither. He's not very visible either. This is Christos Stylianides. He's the commissioner from Cyprus. He's in charge of tourism and migration, so the whole humanitarian crisis. He knows how to figure it out. And he's very qualified because he's a dentist, so... No? Nobody ever seen this man? Camino Vella. Camino Vella is the commissioner for Malta, and he's in charge of the CFP, that's the Common Fisheries Policies. That means that all the policies regarding where you can fish, in which waters, and which fish, at what quantity, he's in charge of telling you what's good for the environment when it comes to fish. And he's also very qualified because he worked in real estate. So there we go. The next one. This is by far the commission in charge of the biggest budget in the European Union. Billions and billions of euros he's in charge of, because this is Phil Hogan, the commissioner from Ireland, and he's in charge of the CAP and the regional development policy. That's the common agricultural policy and regional development policy, which means that he's in charge of now about 40% of the European Union's budget, generating who gets money and for what, which farmer gets money for which wheat we want to be planted, how we want the soil to be used. So Phil Hogan's the man to talk to. This man isn't actually a commissioner. This is just the first stock photo you get when you Google politician. But if I had told you that he is a commissioner, you would have believed me. Sometimes in some lectures in universities, I've actually made up departments and commission departments to just test it, and even people who studied European studies didn't actually know that these don't exist. So really, you can make it up as you go, and they do. So the question is, of course, how do we get here? Yes?
Missing the guy who is in charge of how Engels should cucumber the...
Right, so I believe this is for food standards. I'm not sure exactly which department is in charge of that. That was a big conversation. Actually, one of the biggest conversations about Euroscepticism is always the whole banana issue. Do you know about this? You know, the curvature of bananas? Because if you go on the European Parliament's website, you find myth-busting about EU myths and then the curvature of bananas thing. And which is interesting because they classify it as a myth, but if you read the piece, you found out that regulation 2703-R or something says that bananas cannot have overly crass curvatures. So that's a real regulation. But I will be talking about food standards later in my presentation. Question is, how do we get here? And we got here because of this man, Robert Schuman. Not the greatest expert of Luxembourg. Robert Schuman was Luxembourgish, then he left for France during the Nazi occupation and became French foreign minister. Now, I'm saying not the greatest expert, at least if I go by the definition of who Robert Schuman was and wanted to be according to the people in charge of the European Union today. But don't hurt yourself. But I believe that he will be actually quite appalled by what is happening in the European Union today if he could see it. Robert Schuman started the Schuman Declaration. And the Schuman Declaration on May 9th, 1950, this is why May 9th is actually now a public holiday in many European Union member states, in which he said that in order to avoid another world war in Europe, we have to pull together industries. And by pulling together industries, we would make it economically non-feasible for countries to be at war. If Germany needed French resources to produce ammunitions and so on, then it wouldn't be possible to organize that war. And the economic dependencies of both nations would make it not economically interesting for them to be at war. And there is some truth in that. He also said that we should organize this under a high authority, so that the nations that participate in this free trade need a high authority and organization that manifests the desires of where this bloc wants to go. And he does talk about a European federation. And now here's the question, because since Robert Schuman mentioned the European Federation, all the European federalists have told us that he meant that he wanted to have a United States of Europe. So one unitary country governed by the same rules. The question, of course, is, does a federation mean an organic group or a federal state? You can have a federation of tennis clubs, where all the tennis clubs still have the same right to decide about the policies that they want to have, or the rules, or whatever, which does not mean you need to have a federal state in which you have a centralized authority which dictates a certain number of rules. And I believe that Robert Schuman was talking about an organic group. So, since Robert Schuman is dead, and since we apparently can claim anything we want about dead people because they're not around to complain, I wrote a piece for City AM in which I said Robert Schuman would be a Eurosceptic if you could see the protectionist EU record today. And I think I have a good case for that when I get to the part about trade. Robert Schuman also said, in taking upon itself for more than 20 years the role of the champion of a united Europe, France has always had as her essential aim the service of peace. A united Europe was not achieved, and we had war. And the question is, of course, how united does this European Union look today? Jean-Claude Juncker says English is losing importance. A few days later, he says that that was just banter, that was just a joke. Michel Barnier says UK risks financial crisis if it diverges from EU regulation. No cooperation can exist and no stability can exist if we don't follow all the same rules, apparently. And Donald Tusk even says that British hopes of future ties are pure illusion. And by the system that we are working right now, apparently I think that might even be true, because if we go by the policies of what Brussels is suggesting right now and what they want for future ties with the United Kingdom, I hardly think it is acceptable. Guy Verhofstadt, of course, my favorite of the worst in the European Parliament. He's the group leader of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. That word, of course, used very, very loosely. He says, we need to get rid of unanimity also in matters of foreign policy. Look to our incapacity today to react to Russian attack on British soil, still EU soil. The silence of Ms. Mogherini on this, Ms. Mogherini, she's the, I mean, nobody knows who she is either. She's the representative for foreign policy, which the European Union doesn't have any of. Everyone has to agree before you react. That no longer works in the New World Order. Now, you couldn't make up a more dystopian tweet if you wanted to, and that's what you get in terms of speeches in the European Parliament as well. So here's an example of what that means. We talk about unanimity. All countries have to agree in certain areas as to what we want to do. So there's a couple of areas in which the European Union has to decide together. If Slovakia says no, it's no. And those areas exist, for example, in tax policies. So they can't come up with new taxes on an EU level if one country says no. So the European Commission a couple of months ago released this document in which it says, how do we gradually improve decision-making in EU tax policy? Which translated means, how do we make new taxes? And they give us this wonderful timeline and document in which they explain to us the failures and the problems that this system of unanimity has created. And they do conclude, and now here where it gets interesting, in this 26 years process, unanimity was used as a tool to create unnecessary delays and obtain concessions. Unnecessary delays to carbon taxation, digital taxation, a wide array of new taxes. By the time you breathed out, we found 3 new ideas that we can tax. Robert Schuman was talking about common agreements and common foundations for economic developments, that we should do it together, but we should do it together because we all think that this makes sense, not because we get it dictated from above. He says that all the advantages that being a member of the group that works together at a European level, that the advantages should exist without distinction or exception. And then he adds at the very end, and this is something that Robert Schuman also believed was important, was the development of the African continent. And the development of the African continent as an example as to what role Europe plays in cooperation with Africa is the best example for where trade policy and the free trade argument that we use in the European Union goes very wrong. There's 3 characteristics of European protectionism. First of all, you have tariffs. That means that, let's say you're a Central African potato producer and you want to export to Europe. You say, my potatoes are pretty good, my climate's pretty good, I can do this cheaply, I'll bring it to Europe, I'll sell it there. It will help me improve my living conditions, it helps me improve the living conditions of my community. The people in Europe have money, they want to try new potatoes, everybody's happy, right? The European Union comes in and says, nah, sorry, there's a tax on this. So if you bring in your potatoes, for every kilo that you bring in, you have to pay a tax. Now, you can be exempted from that tax if your country of origin is part of EBA. EBA is everything but arms. That's a treaty that the European Union signs where you can export everything tariff-free with the exception of ammunitions and firearms. The problem is that only 15 African countries are part of EBA. And for those of you who know, I mean, there's just over 50 countries in Africa. So for most African countries, this does not apply. The second obstacle to your trade is the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP. The CAP essentially means that we subsidize our farmers. We like our farmers, everybody likes their local farmers, they're all jolly and good. We want to buy local apparently all the time. So what we do is we give our farmers money. By the way, the biggest recipients of money from European subsidization of agriculture are Frankfurt Airport and the Queen of England, because they have the most amount of land that they don't use, which is subsidized under EU rules. The Common Agricultural Policy means that we subsidize European producers at the expense of others. So just to give you a perspective, we give our farmers so much money that not only are the products out of Africa not competitive, we are competitive on their markets. So I was talking with a member of the European Parliament a couple of months ago, and he was telling me that he was an observer for the elections of Burkina Faso. And he went to a restaurant and wanted to eat a vegetable soup. And the server said, "Sorry, sir, we don't have vegetables today because the plane from France did not arrive." And why is that? Because in Burkina Faso, vegetables do grow. It's because we subsidize our farmers so much that our farmers fly the products to Africa and compete below local market prices. So we not only do we make competition not possible in Europe, we destroy the local market in different African countries. We bankrupt African farmers and local communities at the for the purpose of supporting our farmers. And every time somebody criticizes these policies, we say, well, do you want your local farmer to go bankrupt? Right? So the conversation is pretty much always the same. And now you could say, well, Bill, I'm a really good farmer. I have a really good potato. My country is part of EBA, so I'm lucky. I can actually compete even with the subsidized farmers in Europe. And then you go, now I'm finally with my potatoes on the market. And then you will get struck by the third one, that's food standards. For most people, for most European consumers, food standards is something good, right? You know, we want our food to have a certain standard. We want to know that if we bite into the potato, we don't die. And that's the narrative that they use every time. This is all about consumer protection. But in reality, this is more protectionism. Because what happens if there is a potato that comes in that actually rivals the local products? The farmers go to Brussels, the European farmers go to Brussels, and they say, we have a new proposal for new regulations for food standards that give us more safety. And these rules always somehow apply to new products coming in from outside of Europe. And then suddenly the food standards apply. The compliance costs are very high because the farmers in Africa would have to figure out, does my potato actually comply with EU rules? And he does not have the money to invest to check all the legal standards that he needs to respect to. When it also comes to transport and refrigeration of different products, it becomes very, very expensive. And that is protectionism. And let me give you a practical example of something that happened not too long ago, and where you see the destructiveness of this policy. The European Union said, we give development aid to Myanmar and Cambodia. These are very problematic governments with civil war and landmines and corrupt governments and so on. So what the European Union said is, what we could do instead of sending money there, is we trade with these countries. So they made them a part of everything but arms, and they said you can trade tariff-free. And for these two countries, the export of rice is very interesting, because their rice is cheaper and tastier. So with in these countries, farmers said, oh, now we can trade tariff-free with the European Union. So what we're going to do is we're going to rack up the production. We invest money, we take up loans, we take up debt, we invest into new farms, bigger farms, more land, new machinery, and so on. So that's what they did, and they started exporting to Europe. And they were rivaling the local rice producers in Europe. And then when the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Italian rice farmers found out that this was actually quite problematic for them, because the European consumer actually liked the rice coming from Myanmar and Cambodia, and it was cheaper, that could not be possible. They went to the European Commission and they said, we need to do something about this, you're going to bankrupt our industry. And within a couple of days, the European Commission reimposed an even higher tax on these countries. So all the people who took up loans and invested into their farms to produce more, they are doomed to go bankrupt, because we gave them false hope, we let them import, and then we cut them off. Under every single other arrangement that individuals or groups could have, you could call it fraud. In the European Union, we call it consumer protection. Robert Schuman was also concerned that the rules that this organization gives itself would not be respected. So he suggested that an organization such as the United Nations should be in charge of verifying if these rules are respected. I'm not sure if the United Nations is necessarily the good body for that, but we'll just leave it at that, because that's never what happens. No organization is actually checking on whether or not the European Union respects its own rules. It does have the European Court of Justice, which I will get into at a later stage. So there's two treaties that are important in the European Union when it comes to which qualifications do the countries, the member states, need to get to. One of them is the Maastricht Treaty. You don't need to respect the Maastricht Treaty to join, but you're expected to use it as a guideline for your economic development. So the Maastricht criteria, you can't exceed 60% of debt per GDP, inflation is capped at a certain rate. So that's the goals that you need to achieve. And by the way, by the time you achieve these goals, you need to take the euro, which is exactly what happened in Slovakia. So here's a not up-to-date list and not complete list of all the countries that violate the Maastricht Treaty right now. I can actually say that my home country, Luxembourg, does respect it. It's one of the very few. And so these are all the countries that don't respect all the goals that we think are important. And then we have the Copenhagen criteria. The Copenhagen criteria, you need to respect those in order to become a member. So it says something about stability of the rule of law, human rights, respect of the individual, functioning market economy. And if we factor all the conditions that the European Commission gives, and we factor in all the reports of the countries as they stand right now, we find that the countries in violation is, pretty much everyone. Well, that's a bit depressing. Let's continue. When we go on the website of the European Parliament, we find a couple of founding fathers, and we see, of course, Robert Schuman is one of them. And this, interestingly, as a fun fact, maybe on the side, Winston Churchill is right in the middle. And I find that a bit confusing because I didn't really see Winston Churchill as the big EU federalist as he is presented. When you go to the European Parliament in Brussels and you go to the Parliamentarium, what you see is the first thing you see is a quote by Winston Churchill, in which Winston Churchill explains that we need a United States of Europe. And I was sort of hat scratching because I remember that quote a bit differently, and I found that they forgot the second part of it. So this is what it says in the Parliamentarium. It says, we must build a kind of United States of Europe. In this way only will hundreds of millions of toilers be able to regain the simple joys and hopes which make life worth living. Turns out, in the next sentence, you can read the whole thing, I can also send you the presentation if you're interested. In the next sentence, he says that the United Kingdom should not be a part of that. So you can do your thing, but we don't want to be a part of it, which does seem to be what happened in the end. So in a general sense, we need to sort of get a sense of where we want to go with this. So we need to find out what are European values. So what do they mean by European values? And I would say objectively, these are like the criteria that most people would agree on is what people talk about when they talk about European values in the context of the European Union. We talk about democracy, we talk about the rule of law, we talk about tolerance, we talk about solidarity. So let's just take these apart one by one. Democracy being the first. So this is the trilogue system. This is too complicated and for the most people a story for another time, but that's how it works. When the European Commission creates legislation, by the way, the only body that's allowed to create legislation, they give it to the European Council and the European Parliament. The Council represents the states, the European Parliament represents the citizens. Then these two come up with conclusions and amendments. They say that this is what we want to achieve in terms of the member states, this is what we want to achieve for the citizens. Now, these rarely match, of course, which is not terribly surprising. So what they organize in terms of finding out what they should do with a piece of legislation, they organize trilogues. These trilogues, here they have 3 rounds, they can also have 25 rounds, are secret meetings in which the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council meet in order to figure out what they do with this piece of legislation. Nobody knows who sits on in these meetings. Many parliamentarians in the European Parliament don't know who sits in the meetings. There's no public record of it, there's no report, there's nothing that gets given to the press. Now, why is that relevant? Because in these meetings, what happens is trade-offs. Very often, it happens that a country, let's say Slovakia, opposes a certain tax or opposes a certain piece of legislation. And then after a couple of rounds of trilogue, Slovakia comes out and says, we love this idea. So my question, of course, as somebody who covers this extensively is, what happened? What trade-offs were given? And the problem that I see is very often this perception that people think that all countries are equal in the European Union, which of course is not true. Bigger countries are stronger than others because they have other relationships between the countries. if European member states were individual islands floating around and sometimes met in the middle to decide on policy, that would maybe be true. But the reality is that many countries have trade relationships between each other. So for instance, if Slovakia says to France, we don't like this new airline tax that you suggest, then France says, okay, we understand that, but listen, we were thinking about a new place for this Airbus factory. And we thought about Slovakia. It would create 200 jobs, big factory, good before the elections that you got coming up. This could be interesting for you. If you say yes to our tax, we'll give you the factory. And that's what happens in reality in those trade-offs. It happens in the council, it happens in the trilogues, it happens all the time. And there's no transparency as to how it actually works. It's actually a worse system than many member states have. There's this quote, so this is by Dan Hannan, a politician I much enjoy, and he was actually re-elected now to the European Parliament, to my joy. He says, there's a popular joke in Brussels that if the European Union were a country applying to join itself, it would be rejected on the grounds of being undemocratic. And I believe that is very true, because if you analyze the systems of the European Union, you will find very soon that it could not join itself. So then he would say, okay, Bill, I get it. It's not entirely democratic. It's not entirely transparent. There's a lot of money being wasted. We don't really know who the people are. But there's consultations, right? So there's consultations in which you as a citizen can give your opinion. The European Commission goes out and says, hey, citizen, do you have opinions? Let us know. So I recommend for all of you that you try this out. I really, all of you can do this online. You just go and try this out for a second. So I tried to do this for the digital tax. So the European Union was suggesting we should put a digital tax on the big companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and so on. All the services that we enjoy should be taxed even more by virtue of taxing the companies. So I went online, and my answer that I wanted to give is, I want no tax. Interestingly, the questionnaire that they were giving me really didn't give me an option of saying I don't want the tax. The only way I was able to answer the questions by clicking was how I was going to implement the tax. So there was no real option to answer what I wanted to. Sometimes there was a box that said other, in which I wrote don't put a tax, and that's what I did. Interestingly, all the consultations disappear if they don't actually say what the Commission wants to hear. So prior to the press conference, if the consultation says what the Commission likes, then they will keep it online and they will mention it. If it doesn't say what they like, it usually disappears from the web. So there goes your consultation. The European Centre for International Political Economy, during the negotiations about the TTIP agreement, they looked at the answers that were given in the consultations. And they found that in the TTIP consultations, 97% of all answers were copy-pasted, essentially, with different online tools, where NGOs, anti-trade, anti-free trade NGOs were using tools that were able to replace them. And then the Commission said, oh yeah, there's so much concern by all these groups. Well, if you actually look through, you find that most of it is really just copy-pasted. So democracy is problematic, I get it, but we have the rule of law, right? I mean, we have the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice, they will check on all the rules, right? That's what it's for. So I'll give you a very concrete example to tell you about the European Court of Justice and how it works. And there's one particular case that I like, which is very recent, and that will explain to you very well what is wrong with the European Court of Justice. Case in point, November 22nd, 2018. What happened? So, does anyone know snus? Anyone heard of this tobacco that you put under your lip? So many people use it as a way to stop smoking. It's very popular in Scandinavia. It reduces smoking rates considerably in Sweden. It gives people the ability to not have pulmonary related diseases and still consume the nicotine and tobacco in a certain way. Snus has been banned in the European Union since 1992. It's banned completely for sale. You can have it on you, nobody will arrest you for possession, but you cannot sell it in a store. In Sweden, it is legal, because Sweden, when it joined in 1995, negotiated an exemption of snus in Sweden, called Swedish Match, went to court and said, look, this makes no sense. From every point of view, this is not a proportional rule. I mean, the rules of the European Union says that all laws should be made proportionally to the effect that we want to achieve. Cigarettes are still legal, and they are way more harmful than snus, so I don't get it why my product is outlawed. And my product actually helped some people stop smoking, so I don't understand it. So the court says two things, and it says everything that's wrong with this court. And this is a lot of legalese coming in here. it says that if placed on the market, it would represent a novel product for consumers. In that context, it remains likely that member states may be led to adopt various laws, regulations, and administrative provisions designed to bring to an end the expansion in the consumption of tobacco products for oral use. So it basically says if there's snus, people might use it. So I guess that's true. It doesn't take into account that people will switch from cigarettes to snus, but it says that there could be a problem that member states might have to regulate. But this is not the biggest problem, because in the next paragraph it says this. So they say, when it comes to the claim by the company, in which it says that other tobacco products, such as cigarettes, they essentially mean cigarettes here, that they are permitted on the market while snus is not, demonstrate that the prohibition on the placing on the market of tobacco products for oral use is disproportionate. It must be recalled that an EU measure is appropriate for ensuring attainment of the objective pursued only if it genuinely reflects a concern to attain it in a consistent and systematic manner. Now, what this means is that the court says that the producer is right in saying that his rights were violated because it doesn't make sense to allow cigarettes and not snus. And the court recognizes that double standard. But then it says the role of the court is not that individual. It is reflect the European Union. So the court says, we're not here to protect your rights. We are here to protect the interests and the policies of the European Union. Because if we allowed snus, which it says in the previous paragraph, if we allow snus, people might consume more tobacco. That is contrary to the policy made in Brussels. Therefore, we cannot allow it. Even if your rights were violated, we do not care because it's against the policy. So then you have tolerance and solidarity. And whoever's listened to the conversations that we had in the European elections right now, and the conversations that we had since Brexit, I kind of wonder where that solidarity is. Because when Ryan about European values, he meant that the fact that free trade prevents war does not only work if you're a member of the same club, it is universal, it is always true. So you should include countries and even other continents in your logic because it is universally a value, not because you only get it as a benefit of being a member of a club. But I don't see that tolerance and solidarity being reflected. We only see solidarity as a means of redistribution by the state. So I'm asking, could there be more European values? And I see some of them already being reflected. So apparently centralization is a European value right now. Having a European president, that's what they usually mean by that. Consumer protection, whatever that means. Welfare payments, we are now talking about a European minimum wage. Emmanuel Macron is suggesting that, which would be the same amount in euros in every country. So not quite sure what the level of that minimum wage will be, but I'm pretty sure that it should be different between France and Bulgaria. But that's just me, I'm not an economist. Higher taxation, that of course is a European value, because European value is also environmental policy. So we need a new tax on flights. They want to put a tax on kerosene and on different other things. So it's all European values. I heard the European values argument being made for the Erasmus spending. I've heard the European values argument being made to give 18-year-olds free Interrail tickets on the day of their birthday. That's a real policy, by the way. Look it up. I didn't believe it. Oh, well, there you go. Don't worry, the next 18-year-olds will all get a ticket. That's the new proposal. Because at first it was just a lottery and 10,000 people. Now everybody gets an Interrail ticket. You get an Interrail ticket, you get an Interrail ticket, everybody gets free stuff that you paid for. Maybe more European values. Maybe there's going to be a European president or a prefect instead of states, in which decentralized state in Brussels just sends their minions over to your state and tells you how you should do things. So I'm saying, go back, it's a trap. And we are in the trap very deep already, and it's not getting any better. And some people are agreeing with me. I see the Prime Minister of Denmark, who says that if we have only 27 member states, we should only have a budget for 27. By the way, a very radical position in Brussels. to say that we should decrease the budget if we have less members. Finland, which will have the presidency, the council presidency of the European Union, seems to agree with that. So the jury is still out on the next budget. They want to increase it to up to 1.3% of GDP. So the contributions that a member state would have to make would be 1.3% of its GDP. For now, it's 1%. That doesn't sound like a lot in percentage points, but that means a lot of money, and that means a lot of money for different countries through agricultural subsidies and so on. And I would say, since we are making up European values, I could also make up my own. So I made up my list, and Bill's European values look a bit different. Mine has limited government, because that's all I can get from the European Union. I mean, limited government sounds pretty good for a start. Private property, localism, and free markets. Since those are my European values now, if you oppose them, you must be anti-European, right? And to me, that whole argument is not very conclusive. It's not very good. We need to bring the argument back to what we want to achieve. We wanted to achieve a situation in which people talk, travel, and communicate, cooperate within the European Union, or whatever you want to call the organization. We want to have that freedom to move and freedom to trade, but we don't want one person in one particular city telling us what to do. And my belief is that what we are seeing right now, where people are more and more polarized, and we saw it in the election on the weekend, people vote more and more for parties that might be against the European Union, but aren't even free market and pro-freedom in any way for themselves. Just because Marine Le Pen is against the European Union doesn't mean I like her. I actually detest her far-right policies. She is a socialist as many others. And my argument for the people who say that the European Union needs to have more power, and maybe if you have those conversations with people who really enjoy the European Union, is always that the power that you give to the European Union right now can be wielded by somebody else in the future. I read this interesting blog post by a European federalist, a German European federalist, and he was writing, 15 years ago we thought that the Eurosceptics were dangerous because they wanted to leave the European Union. Today we know that they are dangerous because they want to stay in the European Union. Because the Kaczynskis and the Salvinis and the Le Pens of the world have understood that the power that the European Union gives them makes it possible for them to change the European Union in their image. And so all the power and all the rules that you change to give the EU more power might eventually come to haunt you. And that is my argument always towards people who love the European Union, is like, look at it from the perspective of if somebody else was in power. When somebody tells you, yes, we need a European military, I always ask, do you want it to be guided by Marine Le Pen? Because that's a real possibility. And that's something you need to keep in mind. It's not about necessarily do you like the policies as they are right now. It is the question of how much power do you give to the government. And that's where you can start the conversation when you have the conversation about the European Union. And that's it for my part. I thank you so much for your attention, and open to any questions. Right, any questions? Or comments?
Yes. Okay, so this is here clearly.
Do I give the microphone because of the recording?
This is clearly fucked up. So what do we do? So what would you say would be the best strategy to end this?
So I always get this question because they always ask me, like, can we reform the European Union from within? I say, sure, I guess in the same way that you can join the mafia to change it from within. You can see how that goes. No, the changing from within stuff is a bit difficult because the treaties are written in a way that you can only go more integration. And that's what they are pushing for. And you have a large political majority wanting to do that. Because everybody has their own priorities. Even the Eurosceptic far right also has, the Italians, they say right now that, oh yeah, we need to have more support for our farmers. And they know that they can only get that much money, not out of their own economy, if you look at Italy right now, but if you have other productive economies subsidizing them. So even those people that apparently are against the European Union are no actual reformists because they want to use it to their benefit. So to me, the best way of going about this is if a considerable amount of countries leave. You can call me traditional in that sense, but I believe that the classic Euroscepticism of let's just get out of this is a good way to go. Unfortunately, too many people are already in on the scheme. Well, a scam or scheme, whichever you want to call it. And if you're a farmer and you receive most of your income as subsidies from the European Union, I can't even necessarily blame you for supporting it, because you've made yourself dependent on that, and you have no other future than that. So there needs to be a certain scaling back, and you have certain countries, for instance, as in Scandinavia right now, which say, okay, there's certain things that we need to scale down on. And that's a good start. If you get a considerable part of the population out of the necessity of having European Union programs exist for them, then they can also decide to be independent and make the decision to leave. Now, this is something, of course, which is more accessible to bigger countries than it is to smaller countries. If my country, Luxembourg, were to leave and have no ties with its neighboring countries, that would be very, very difficult, because it's all about financial services and trade. So it's not accessible to every country in the same way. But there are other bigger countries that could decide to leave. And it could be Poland, it could be Hungary, it could be Italy. So that remains to be seen. But to me, it's the best system would be for individual countries to leave bit by bit. There was another question. I'll repeat the question just for the microphone. Then. Yeah.
What's your overall point of view on the whole concept of European Union? Do you think it's good to connecting the states into a bigger form of some, let's say, state, or how do you call it? So when you do it in a small case like in Europe, you want to expand it to the whole world, right? At least, what's the point to do it in a small scale, like in Europe, and do it bigger?
Right, so the argument that we always hear is why do we need to band together? Is always because we need to defend ourselves against the bigger players in the world. You hear that argument a lot. They keep giving you these numbers. They say, oh, in 20 years' time, no European nation or just one European nation will be part of the G7 or the G8. So that's the argument that you hear all the time. And I don't think that's a very conclusive argument, by the way, because some of the most successful countries in the world, such as Singapore and Hong Kong, are very small countries with no armies or limited abilities in that sense, and they still manage. Putting all of our regulations together will actually make us less competitive. Because the advantage in Europe is that we have different abilities to pick and choose. If I don't like the business regulation in the Czech Republic, Slovakia is not too far away, and maybe Slovakia will compete and try to attract the business there and have lower regulations. These advantages have prevented many countries from raising taxes too high. If you harmonize taxation, you harmonize all the rules, people always say, oh, we should harmonize corporate income tax. And I say, well, okay, but then we don't get the Estonian flat tax, we get the French level taxation, and that's going to devastate many of the economies. And the question is, do we want that? Just for the sake of standing united. The Soviet Union stood very united, and it went down in the same way. So to me, it's not a conclusive argument that we need it for strength. Will it try to expand? Is it like a world government type thing? I don't think so. It's not a realistic situation, because eventually there's too many power struggles, and we need to invent more political posts for all these people who want to be in charge of a country, right? So to me that's not a conclusive one. Again, I think that the strength of Europe comes from the competition. And it started as early as the Renaissance, when the Dutch were hosting all the artists and thinkers and scientists because they were thrown out by the Vatican, thrown out of Italy. And they were hosting them, and then consequently the Netherlands became a more innovative and prosperous country. So there was always this competition as to, I'll give you freedom that's beneficial for me. If you get rid of all of these differences, then there's no voting with your feet. Then there's no other country you can go to. And those reduced amount of choices is, to me, very dangerous. Yes.
There was actually one guy who had basically the extreme argument that if whole world connected to a single state, and if something somehow screwed up, and the state would become as bad as North Korea, for instance, then we are screwed, because these days at least North Koreans have some chance of escaping. It's not easy, but some of them did escape. But the moment there is one global state, there will be no place to escape. So that's kind of like I and he made this argument that this is good reason to not expand the size of states or these organizations, because if it happens, we are screwed. So what's your opinion on this?
Well, I don't think world government is going to happen anytime soon, or I don't think that the attempt for that is going to happen either. The United Nations is more of a joke than an attempt for world government. But the point, of course, is very true about the choices that you have, and there's many examples of that within Europe. I mean, even if it's just different regulations on, we're going to see very changing regulations on things like cannabis in the future in the European Union, and the motivation to give people the freedom to consume cannabis comes out of the economic advantage. So Luxembourg is legalizing cannabis, the entire supply chain, within the next 2 to 3 years, and that's going to attract a lot of businesses. And then Spain says, oh, we can get the economy for our farmers up if we do this as well. And if France then still chooses to be restrictive about cannabis policy, they will have to choose to take that loss in comparison to their neighboring countries. If we generalize the rules, we don't have those options, and we will need to travel to Belarus, hopefully not, to reach any type of differences. So that is a real threat, and it's a type of dystopian threat that we didn't think we were going to be, troubled by 20 years ago, but it's now a reality, because it's always further integration, more and more rules being done together. And I think when it comes to areas such as education, that's where it gets really dangerous, because if we centralize what is being taught in our classrooms to children by one political body in one particular city, that's where we start seeing people having very odd views about the European Union. I mean, I see that right now with all these youth projects that the European Union subsidizes. All the people who come out of that are just drones. They just repeat this mantra. I had a guy tell me that we shouldn't get rid of the Erasmus program because he met his girlfriend in Spain. I said, well, that's wonderful. Your family has enough money to fund all of that. I don't quite see why a mechanic who didn't go to university should fund your wine drinking in Valencia. That to me doesn't make quite sense. But the problem is that all these funded programs incentivize people to stop questioning different sets of beliefs. So I think that if we start moving in the area of education, that's where it gets really troubling. And I think that's where eventually they want to go. So, sorry to be so pessimistic.
I would like to ask about how it looks with cheap flights. About this tax on cheap flights, how is it going? How it looks? If it can really happen, and maybe you can mention Consumer Choice Center campaign if it's still going. Yeah.
So I'm also a policy analyst for the Consumer Choice Center, and it's a free market consumer group, and we defend the rights of the consumer to make their own choices when it comes to consumer goods. The Dutch government is currently proposing in the council a new tax of €7 per flight. That means that every flight you take departing from a member state of the European Union, you will have to pay an additional €7. That means on your return flight, that's 14. If you have a connecting flight return, that's 28 per flight. So this is a tax proposal. So by virtue of a tax proposal, you have unanimity in the council. So every country needs to say yes. What they do, however, very often, so this is good counter, like a good example is that's what happened with the gun legislation. So when the Commission suggested the gun legislation, it was a safety measure. But all measures of safety are delegated to the member states. So everybody needed to say yes. But Slovakia and the Czech Republic and others were not going to say yes. So what they did is they rebranded it as a single market question. And then they can use qualified majority voting and they can outvote the smaller countries. And that's what they could do with this proposal. Problem is that since they call it a departure tax, the European Court of Justice will have very little leeway to brand it as a single market issue. So what they changed it now to is a kerosene tax. So the proposal now, as maybe an alternative, so both policies are still being submitted in the council, is putting a €330 tax for 1,000 liters of kerosene, which could eventually mount up to the same level of taxation per flight. And so the Consumer Choice Center, actually, my organization, we have a campaign against this. We have a campaign against the departure tax. We call it the Hands Off My Cheap Flights campaign. I actually quite encourage you, if you have any fiat currency left, you can donate to our campaign. What we ask people is to donate €7, so that's the amount of the tax. Donate it once so you never have to pay it again. We do a lot of grassroots activism, and we talk to diplomats and policymakers, and we write articles and appear on TV. And if you want to support our activism against that particular tax, it's much appreciated. You will find it on consumerchoicecenter.org. You can find all the details on that. So thanks for mentioning that. So we are still fighting that, and to us it also seems which will further the East-West divide, because the countries that currently support the tax are Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, France, and Finland. In Finland, in Helsinki, you can't even get a pint of beer for €7, but in Romania, €7 actually gets you a lot of things. And to have that disparity and people not realizing that will further the divide of the differences between the different countries is, to me, very concerning. And then they are surprised that suddenly we have an East-West divide. We told them. So, yeah. Any other comments or questions? Sure.
So, I mean, we know that centralized governments don't work because of all the many reasons, right? So, would it be a qualified strategy to say, let them expand as fast as possible, as much as possible, in order that they burn themselves to the ground, and we can start over sooner? Wouldn't that then be also an argument against trying to slow down and as you do, try to advocate against the centralizing regulation, because that just postpones the ultimate crash, and therefore the boom up is going to be much longer, and therefore the bust much more hard and more difficult.
Every talk I give, I always have an accelerationist in the crowd. And it's always that argument. It's like, oh, we should really encourage them to do more of this because eventually they will destroy the whole thing. That argument is also being made for voting for Jeremy Corbyn in the UK by saying, oh, if you vote for this guy, we'll have socialism and then we can get Margaret Thatcher back somehow after 5 years. And there's a certain argument in it because there's some historical precedent for it, but I'm also quite worried about the destruction that happens in the meantime. You can make the same case like, oh, if we have the Russian Revolution and then we get Stalinism and the Soviet Union for a long time, we also get Ayn Rand. So that's not too bad, right? You know, and so we have an inspiration for a whole generation of politicians in the United States of free market philosophy. You could even make the same claim for the Weimar Republic. Oh, let's vote the Nazis in because we'll get some free market policies in the future. Why can't we have it right now? Because what happens is that in accelerationism, is that the reason why people become freer is not because of ideology. It's because they know it really sucked to be ruled by a dictator. But they don't learn from that, right? In the case of the Third Reich, it's a bit of a different system because we established some sort of ground rules of the rights of the individual as a result. But for most dictatorships, this doesn't happen. If it's military dictatorships in South America or Latin America, these things, there's no real conclusion as to what government ought to do. They just know, oh, we're kind of starving right now, not too great, everybody gets shot, let's change it to a freer system, which doesn't really prevent them 20 years later from reaching the same conclusion, oh, this dictator is different. And that's what keeps happening. I think, by the way, this is what it's going to happen in Venezuela. I don't think it's good that Venezuela crumbles right now. I think Venezuela should steadily do better. Because if it crumbles and people just said, oh, it was Maduro was bad, right, okay. But this new socialist guy, he seems pretty good. So there's no real philosophical conclusion drawn from it. And that's why I think accelerationism doesn't work. It works in the short term, but as somebody who is interested about the long term, I don't think it provides the right solutions.
Yeah, and I would like to ask about this digital tax, maybe. I'm not sure if it's there's some official name for this, but one Slovak journalist recently wrote an article about this, and well, here the argument, the problem is that, for example, Google and these tech companies, they are based in Ireland, where they pay like minimum taxes, and states where Google, for example, operates want to tax it and have more money from its income that it makes in this particular state. And the problem is, or here the argument for like taxation on European level and because it's much more easier for Google to operate in different countries. It would be a problem if different countries have different regulations and different taxation and different offices and stuff. So it would be better, according to him, to have one huge or one taxation on European level and then redistribute it to countries. What do you think about it, or what's the argument against this?
Sure. There is an official proposal already for the digital tax by the European Commission. When we first had the debate, they were saying, oh, it is unfair that they are taxed in Ireland as opposed to taxed where they actually have their activity, right? Sort of a VAT consumption approach to digital services. So essentially, at the beginning, because they didn't have a threshold, it would have meant that every digital company that runs a service in a certain country will have to be taxed in that country. So if you are an ad company and you run an ad in France, even though you're based in Germany, you will be taxed for the ad in France, which, by the way, still doesn't prevent you from being taxed in Germany, right? So it would have bankrupted a lot of small digital companies in Europe. And so when they found out that, oh, by the way, we're kind of bankrupting the whole digital service that we're trying to prop up, they said, oh, it's only from a certain level of turnover, so that only includes Google, Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft, which they call the GAF, and Facebook, so GAFAM is what they call it. And essentially it's a tax on those big companies. I mean, it's more of a populist measure than anything else. It's just like, let's tax the rich and put the standards in such a way that it only affects all the American companies and no European companies, which is ironic because we're apparently trying to create the Silicon Valley of Europe, so eventually our own companies will be affected by this as well. I mean, it's essentially the problem of every consumption tax. I mean, it eventually will be paid by the consumer. You know, with GDPR, we said, oh, we have so much great protection, but I can't read the LA Times and the Chicago Tribune anymore because they don't give access to these services for European audience because it's just not profitable anymore because of the compliance costs. So this could also happen for the digital tax. So if certain promotions and certain Amazon services are available for Americans, if the margins are very short and you add additional taxes on it, those will not be available for European consumers. So eventually you will have fewer services and more expensive services as a result. And this is why I've opposed the tax, and actually Consumer Choice Center also opposes the tax. The advantage is that we won't have it in the foreseeable future because of Germany. Because Trump found out that these are only American companies, and he said, oh, if you do that, then I put some more tariffs on your German cars. And then Germans were like, maybe not. So this is why it's currently frozen. France, however, decided, I believe, a week ago that they want to introduce it by themselves. So they have another tax. I think France has now added its 258th tax. So that's a new one for people to pay. So we'll see how that works. In my prediction, they will have it for 10 years, realize it's a complete failure, get rid of it, and then argue again for it on an EU level. And I think by that time, we will have an even more statist majority that will actually approve it. So, yeah. Sorry for being pessimistic. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for coming tonight. I much appreciate your time and attention. And let's have a drink.
Okay, great. Thank you for coming. You read it well, so.